Hello students. Today we are going to discuss our new topic, that is objectivity in social research. As we have already completed our two topics in our previous presentation, that is meaning, definition and significance of social research. The other point which we had discussed, that is criteria of a good research. So Uh, the objectivity is an important concept in social research. This topic is extremely important because whenever we conduct research, we want our findings to be reliable and based on evidence rather than on our personal opinions or prejudices. As social researcher, our aim should be to understand society systematically and scientifically. So students, the objective of this topic is to develop an understanding of the essential criteria that determine the quality and the reliability of social research. Students, before we talk about the objective, we need to understand why objectivity is important for research quality. Research should not simply provide information, it should provide information that we can trust. If a researcher allows personal opinions, prejudices, or expectations to influence the research, the quality of the research can be affected. Therefore, objectivity becomes one of the important criteria for determining whether research findings are reliable or not. Now, the learning outcome, which is talking about that by the end of this topic, I expect you to be able to answer two important questions. First, what do you mean by objectivity in social research? And second, what factors can prevent a researcher from being objective? So while studying this topic, don't just memorize the definition. Try to understand the political difficulties that researchers face while conducting research in society. So students, let's begin with our topic, objectivity in social research. Now we come to the central concept, objectivity. In simple words, objectivity means looking at the evidence without allowing our personal feelings or preferences to influence our judgment. The word dispassionately is important here. It means that researchers should examine evidence calmly and impartially. For example, suppose I'm a researcher, students, opinions about online education. If I personally strongly support online education, I should not select any those responses that supports my own opinion. Instead, I should give an equal importance to positive as well as negative responses. Therefore, objectivity requires the researcher to ask, what does the evidence actually tell me, rather than what do I want the evidence to tell me. Okay, now we'll see the meaning of research. The next part is talking about the meaning of the objectivity. So objectivity means basing our conclusion on facts rather than on personal opinions. Imagine, I'm giving you one example. Imagine that a researcher believes that social media has a negative effect on young people. If here the researcher begins a study with this belief and deliberately searches for information that proves the belief, the researcher is not objective over here. Rather than the researcher should give or instead collect the data systematically and allow the findings to guide the conclusion. There are two stages where bias can enter in your research. The one at the time of data collection when you are collecting the data. So you may, as a researcher, collect the information selectively, that all those information which you want. Maybe you select all that data only. Second, when you are interpreting the data, okay, at the time of data interpretation. So the researcher may interpret the same information according to the personal belief. Therefore, both the data and the inference drawn from the data should be as free from bias and prejudice as possible. Okay, so now the question arises over here, is complete objectivity is possible? When I'm saying that you have to keep your bias, your research should be free from biasness and prejudices, your opinion. So is this possible? So modern feminist researcher and critical social researcher argues that research is also moral political activity and that researcher may need to commit to a value position. The presentation is talking about the value freedom is a myth. Now students, we have to look at the other side of the debate also. When we are talking about the traditional approaches to research, these traditional approaches emphasizing the objectivity and value freedom. However, feminist research and critical social researcher have questioned whether a research can ever be completely free from values. Why? Because a researcher is also a member of a society. Okay, the researcher has experiences, beliefs, and social background and values. For example, I'm giving an example. When deciding what topic to research, the researcher has already made a choice over there that this topic I'm going to select for my research. So that choice may itself be influenced by social concern or values. Like whenever that person or whatever, like he may feel that this topic is feasible for me to continue the research work. So again here he is getting influenced by that and he's selecting that topic only. Okay, so these researchers argued that research cannot always be completely separated from the social and moral concern. This gives us an important methodological debate. Can researcher really be completely value free? So, traditional research emphasizes objectivity, whereas critical and feminist approach highlight the role of values and social position over here. Now let's begin with our factors which is affecting the objectivity. Yes, as it is one of the ethics that you have to maintain the objectivity when you are doing your research, when you're collecting your data. Now, what all are the factors which is affecting the objectivity, which we're going to see in this slide. So, when I'm talking about the factors affecting the objectivity, so again here, what all are the factors? That is personal prejudices and biasness, your value judgment, your ethical dilemmas, complexity of social phenomena. Students, achieving objectivity in social science is particularly difficult. Why? Because we are studying human beings and society. Unlike some physical phenomena, where they are having a physical sciences, okay, social sciences are different with the physical sciences. So here we are dealing with the human behavior, which is influenced by emotions, relationship, culture, beliefs, and social circumstances. Okay, so these factors playing a very important role, which is affecting the objectivity when you are doing a research. Now, when we are talking about the first point, that is personal prejudices and biasness. So, a prejudice, what is mean by prejudice? A prejudice is a preconceived opinion that we hold before examining the evidence properly. For example, suppose a researcher believes that students from a particular social background are less interested in education. If this assumption influences the way the researcher asks questions, selects response, or interprets answer, then the research becomes biased. The important point is a researcher should not accept something as true simply because it agrees with their existing belief. Evidence must be examined very much carefully. Okay. Now next is value related problems over here. So every researcher lives within a particular social environment. Okay, our ideas about poverty, inequality, gender, education, family, religion, politics, and other social issues can be influenced by our values. So, example, two researchers may study poverty but approach the subject differently because they have different understanding of its causes. Therefore, researchers need to be conscious for their own values. The important thing is not simply to say I have no values. Instead, researchers should recognize that values may exist and make efforts to prevent those values from unfairly influencing the research process. Okay. Now next point is personal preconceptions. A preconception, what is mean by preconception? It is an idea or assumption that we already have before conducting the research. And this can be particularly dangerous because sometimes the researcher may not even realize that the preconception is influencing the research. For example, if researcher assumes that elderly people are not comfortable with technology, the researcher may unconsciously frame questions in a way that confirms this assumption. So, personal preconceptions can influence research without the researcher consciously intending to be biased. This is why researchers need self-reflection and methodological discipline. Okay? Next, we are having ethical dilemmas. So another important factor is ethical dilemmas. Research does not take place in isolation. Researchers may interact with the sponsors, respondents, institutions, and source of data. Sometimes these relationships can create pressure. For example, imagine that an organization sponsors a research project. If the findings are unfavorable to the organization, there may be pressure on the researcher to change or present the finding differently. Similarly, researchers have responsibilities towards their respondents and sources of information. Therefore, ethical issues can create difficult situations for researchers and may affect objectivity. I hope you all have understood. Okay. Now let's begin see the limits of objectivity in social research, or the limitation of objectivity in social research. Students, at this point, we need to understand an important distinction. We have discussed why objectivity is important. But now we ask, are there limits to achieving complete objectivity in social research? According to this presentation, there are several limitations. These limitations arise mainly because social scientists themselves are part of society and because the subject matter they study in human society. So the first is that researcher is a part of society. This is very important limitation. A social scientist is not completely separate from society. For example, when researcher studies family, education, caste, gender, or poverty, the researcher has their own experiences and social background. These experiences can influence the way the researcher sees a particular social issues. Therefore, complete objectivity can be difficult. However, this does not mean that we should abandon objectivity. Instead, researchers should recognize possible source of bias and take methodological steps to minimize them. I hope you have understood the first point. Let's begin the second. Now, second limitation is complexity of social phenomena. Another limitation is complexity of social phenomena, as human behavior cannot always be explained through one simple cause. For example, if we are studying unemployment, we may have to consider education, economic condition, family background, government policies, skills, geographical location, and many other factors. Also, a finding in one social group or one geographical context may not automatically apply to another group or context. Therefore, social research has to pay attention to context. Now, the is the third point is different values in society. We are discussing the third point. Society contains people with different values, beliefs, and experiences. A researcher is also a member of that society. Therefore, researchers may unconsciously carry certain values into their research. For example, what one researcher considers an important social problem may not be considered equally important by another researcher. Okay, so this is why researcher awareness is very much important. Researchers need to constantly ask themselves, am I interpreting this evidence because the evidence supports this conclusion, or because this conclusion agrees with my own values? The next limitation is problem with the respondent, the D point. Finally, students, we have to consider the role of the respondent. The researcher may try to be completely objective, but the respondent may not provide the perfect information. For example, a respondent may refuse to give the answer, the question which have asked to them or which you are asking to them. A respondent may not properly understand the question. A respondent may be reluctant to provide truthful information. These problems can affect the quality of the data. And if the collected data is affected by these problems, the final findings and conclusion may also be affected. So, objectivity is not only about the researcher, it can also be affected by the research situation and the behavior of the respondent. I hope you have understood the meaning of objectivity, importance of objectivity, factors affecting objectivity, and the limits of objectivity. Now, let us quickly revise today's discussion. So, objectivity means examining evidence without allowing a personal bias and prejudices to determine our conclusion. However, achieving complete objectivity in social research is very much difficult because we are having other limitations, such as researchers have personal prejudices, biasness. Researchers are influenced by values. Personal perception or preconceptions can influence research. Ethical dilemmas can create difficulties. Social phenomena are very much complex. Research themselves are part of society and it may affect uh, the objectivity of research. The respondent may refuse to give the answer or misunderstand the question or not give the answer. Therefore, the goal of social research is to make a conscious and systematic efforts to minimize bias and produce a reliable finding. The key question I want you to remember for this is, am I reaching this conclusion because the evidence supports it or because I already believed it? That question captured the importance of objectivity in research. So whenever you are doing your research, this question you have to ask yourself all the time, and whenever you are trying to balance between this, of course you will maintain the objectivity in your research. I hope you all have understood this topic. So here we finish with this topic, that is objectivity in social research. Thank you so much.